Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Again, from the title, you'll know kind of what we're talking about today, and that is deloads, fatigue management, and that sort of thing. And I'm going to just take you through my experience recently with them and what I learned from that too, and how you might be able to take that away and apply it to yourselves. I quite often, as a coach, use my own training, nutrition, whatever it might be, and use myself as kind of that N=1 testing dummy to see kind of what happens in these general scenarios, because I don't want to apply something to my clients before I feel confident in the fact that I can execute it well and it makes good sense. So I did that based off some lifestyle constraints and things like this. So we're kind of going to answer the question of like, are deloads useful, necessary, and generally talk a little bit about fatigue management and my experience with that. So some background. For me personally, I've been running accumulation to deload paradigms of 5-1. So my mesocycle was 6 weeks long. I had 5 weeks of hard overloading training, and then I would take 1 week deload. That's the paradigm, as people would call it, that I've fallen within for years now. And as you guys might know, my general philosophy is to start at a threshold for growth. So kind of the stimulus threshold, as you would call it, as a combination of relative intensity and also volume, and then progress within this so that I can overload and then progressively overload throughout the mesocycle until you essentially hit a wall. And so what happened was, when I get tattoos, I just got a new one, I always try and pre-plan my deloads around this, and so I set things up so that it lands nicely for that. In general, my philosophy for deloads is to have a plan of when they are likely to be, but auto-regulate based off real time, because I think that's very important, because you don't know what's going to happen. Life circumstances can change. You don't want to dig yourself into the ground for weeks on end with performance dropping, you just feeling like crap. Just because you had a deload in many weeks' time, you should probably have deloaded earlier. And likewise, if you feel amazing, you shouldn't just arbitrarily probably just have a deload there. So for me, I had this tattoo planned, and so I had it nicely lined up. But I came to the end of one of my mesocycles, and I was like, I still feel good. And I was like, I typically don't still feel this good when I'm meant to be entering a deload. But I had it so it was timed up with my tattoo. I just didn't care enough, and I was like, I'm auto-regulating, I'm going for a 6th week. It's actually quite rare that I push for 6th week. They happen now and then. I couldn't tell you why. And that's why I think it's important to auto-regulate, because we're not robots and our lives change. I couldn't pin one thing on it, like, oh, my sleep was just way better, or lifestyle stress was less, or I didn't push quite as aggressively earlier on within the meso. There was nothing I really did differently. I typically always just auto-regulate, and then it kind of pans out how it pans out. So I had a 6th week of training. It went well. It was real tough, but it went well. I definitely then earned that deload. However, because I knew I was going to be constrained leading into the tattoo, and I wanted to get at least 5 weeks or close to 5 weeks of hard training, I decided, hey, I've got a rest day on Friday. I took that, and then I took the weekend off. And then on Monday, I was just like, I think in the short term, I was thinking this probably isn't smart. Just going straight into another accumulation phase, another week of hard training after only having really 2 days of deloading, when I typically take a week, which typically buys me 5 weeks. And this is off the back of having trained hard for 6 weeks. So surely this isn't a good move. But I just wanted to kind of see how resilient I was, whether or not I was quote unquote being a pussy, because, you know, sometimes you test yourself in terms of pushing an exercise all the way to failure. For example, like on a hack squat, ideally I don't want to regularly fail on a hack squat. It's quite fatiguing doing that, and I don't think there's extra benefits from going to like a momentary muscular failure point where you can't get it up. And I prefer to leave it at 0 RAR, and typically like that's as good as I need to get, and I see progression over the long term, hunky-dory. But every now and then it might be worthwhile just testing yourself, even on those movements where you're like, man, the fatigue cost is pretty high, it's not super comfortable, I don't think the benefits are really there, and I'm very dialed in with my RAR because it's something I've experienced with, and also it's in a lower rep range, all those sort of things that just allow you to be very precise with your reps in reserve and accuracy of that. But now and then it might be worth testing it. So same here, it's like, let's just see how I get on. So I tried to just go into it as I normally would. and just start off at like, again, my kind of threshold for growth and just go through things. There was a few things that I found happen. So the main thing I found happen was I was still able to perform throughout the entire time. I still held pretty decent performance. The last couple of weeks before going into my tattoo and the deload I've just come off, I did find that I was stagnating in performance, or if I was able to get an extra rep, it was potentially past technical failure. So I was letting my form break down to progress. And I can say for certain the last couple of weeks, in terms of the short-term proxies that sometimes I talk about here, in terms of like the pump, the sensation, in terms of the local fatigue, and when it just feels like you've had a great session, those things start dropping off. This is something some people sometimes talk about, where they feel like they need to back away from training, or training's becoming stale because they're not getting these like great sensations anymore. Like an exercise that used to give them a great pump, everything, all else being equal, is just now not. And maybe they're becoming desensitized to it. So theoretically, you could think, I'm becoming desensitized from the stimulus there. But my kind of thinking is, in theory, I'm meeting overload threshold parameters. I'm creating a stimulus to generate growth. So surely it's still good training if my performance isn't dropping off, which I think still holds, but the fatigue cost might not have been worth it. And I also maybe didn't get as good stimulus across that time, because I did find I hit a wall quite soon in terms of like when I typically add additional set volume, which I don't tend to be very aggressive with that, and it's very sparing. I just couldn't quite do as much. And I think that was down to the fact that, and I really felt this towards the end, I had this just wave, or rather shadow, of accumulated fatigue that hadn't dissipated. So typically you want to take a deload to get rid of all that accumulated fatigue to buy yourself many weeks of great progression. But because I already went in with fatigue, I was already like hitting a wall sooner than necessarily I should. I can also say my experience was I almost thought, because some people talk about the fact that it's like, it's good to have a deload, and maybe even proactive, because you get this buildup of fatigue and potential injuries coming in where you don't necessarily feel it. So this is generally like joints, ligaments, tendons. You don't necessarily feel that you're about to get injured in those areas, and then they just come on. And I took that into this mesocycle thinking, oh man, maybe I'll get injured. And I didn't have that like nocebo effect going in. I didn't get injured. Nothing did happen in that regard. And I've been fine. But I had this, I don't know if people might think of this as like CNS fatigue. I don't know if that's the right term for it, if it's just like neuromuscular fatigue, central fatigue, these sort of things. I just had this wave of, I felt tired. The last 2-3 weeks of training. So basically I bought myself like 2 weeks of feeling pretty fresh and decent. The last 3, I felt pretty fatigued, and I was complaining to my girlfriend Charlotte on a regular basis about just having and feeling tired. Just generally, I didn't feel great. Like I need caffeine, I need a nap. And this was despite getting good sleep and everything else, or feeling like I was getting good sleep. I was also finding sleep was harder to get. Like everything would be the same in my life, but I just didn't have as good sleep. And I think some of these are like markers of fatigue that preempt like the fact that performance is soon going to start hitting a wall and that sort of thing. So like poor sleep, it's kind of a sign that you're getting near to this like overreaching area, which I think I probably did overreach. And not necessarily always the goal of mesocycles to overreach, but you might do now and then. It's kind of, again, like that. You've got to fail to know where away from failure is. You maybe want to overreach now and then to know that you're really testing yourself and pushing to your limits. And so I did learn that. And it basically taught me that what I'd been doing previously was not bad. So to summarize, I didn't get rid of as much accumulated fatigue due to taking just 2 days versus when I normally take 7 days of like deloading or time away from the gym. And therefore I got into like 1-2 weeks of pretty productive training. And then the 3-4, like almost 5 weeks, I felt very fatigued. The kind of short-term proxies of what I use to help give me an insight into how productive training is being weren't in the best place they've been, but performance was still holding. And I was still managing to push through, but this kind of wave of just general lethargy and just never really feeling very motivated to train actually is a key thing as well. I felt in those last like 2-3 weeks, never felt like I had drive to want to go and train. My psychology was feeling just generally fatigued. So I rambled there. Hopefully there was some good insights before we go into like what take homes and practical kind of advice would be in this scenario. So in terms of what I learned, I think it just reinforced what we kind of already know in terms of the theory behind deloading. And you might be thinking even, why did you experiment with this? Well, one is also to test myself and test my limits, but also because we don't really have any great research on deloading. It's a recent study conducted by Max Coleman at Brad Schoenfeld's lab, but it didn't really give us like key takeaways apart from the fact that maybe if you don't feel like you need to deload, don't worry about deloading. I think that's what most people took away from it. But it wasn't, we need more research, direct research on this. And Dr. Pack has been doing great work in terms of like conducting interviews with some of the top coaches in the industry in terms of how do they use deloads. And I think the kind of saying is deload or your body will deload for you is quite well stated. And also the thought of if you do cut your deload short so that you don't actually feel good and ready to go, you're unlikely to buy yourself as much time, like the theory of the kind of fitness fatigue model. So where through a mesocycle, you're developing fitness, which is like performance improving, but you also, to gain that, to overload, you inherently create fatigue. Like there is a fatigue cost, and this fitness and fatigue kind of grow over the weeks, or they increase. There comes a point where your fatigue rises faster than your fitness does, and your performance therefore might drop. And that might be then when you deload. Or you might get to a point where you're like, this is the best performance I can do. I quite often have this with clients. They kind of finish that week where they think they're going to deload the next week. And I'm like, can you beat this performance next week? Or could you about match it? And if they're like, at best I'll match it, but like I'm definitely not going to beat it. And they're pretty confident about that. Sometimes we might test them, especially in like a gaining phase. But if they're cutting, then it's like, what's the benefit of going for like grinding yourself into the dirt? Because the fatigue generated from that would be a lot. So yeah, you accumulate all this fatigue. And then the question is, so how long do we need to rid this fatigue that you've generated where your fatigue is higher than your fitness? And we don't precisely know. I think practically a week is nice. And that's something that's been used for ages. And then the question is, how do we know if it's enough? So you might take 7 days and still feel like tired, unmotivated to train, all those sort of things. You might still feel achy, that sort of stuff. It's probably a good sign that you need a bit longer. You might get to 5 days and feel really, really fresh, very ready to go and able to get into things. So I think you have to kind of listen to some of the fatigue markers that I've kind of spoken about here. So how is your sleep? How's your motivation to train? How's your kind of like freshness in terms of your muscles, joints, ligaments, that sort of thing? Everything before you start training, you want to start fresh. So you don't want to go into it with niggles, with any sort of soreness at all. You want to go in feeling fresh, motivated to train, all those sort of things. In general, that's a great place to start because now you're starting in a strong position to go for a long period of time. An easy analogy is comparing it to dieting. You don't really want to start a diet when you've already got diet fatigue. You don't really want to start a training block when you've already got training related fatigue. And so I think that's a great way to think about it. And I think what it has taught me is that 7 days, as it has worked incredibly well for so many coaches, for myself included, and my clients, it's a great rule of thumb. It's not to say you strictly have to go with that, but especially when you've got to this point where you've pretty much overreached or you're close to, I think that week is going to be necessary. And I can talk about this because I got to this point where I was, I think for sure overreached. And I had my tattoo, of course. I took 4 whole days off. Then I got into the gym and did a bit of light deloady work, and I hated it. I didn't want to be there. It sucked. The next day I did it the same, still sucked. The next day I took it completely off, and that day I was already feeling like, actually, I could see myself getting back into the gym. And then today I've got back into the gym and I'm feeling pretty good. Now, I will say I don't feel as driven as what I typically would hope to get back into training. But I think that's also related to outside circumstances because my appetite and well-being, and I'm at peak mass, so I'm struggling with that sort of stuff. And I'm struggling to eat to maintain my body weight at the moment. So I was just like, I want to get back into training so I can like prevent any kind of muscle loss that might go on because I just can't get this food in, and I'm losing motivation to eat because I'm not training and I'm deloading. So I was just like, hey, one more day is not going to make or break me here. I'm going to get back into some training, get into the mini cut so I can start feeling better and like get in and out as soon as possible. So I think, maybe in a few days I'll reflect on this and regret it a little bit, but I don't think I will. I think I'll actually start feeling better and better as I get back into training here. So yeah, should you skip your deload? No, I don't think you should. Should you auto-regulate your deloads, especially as someone who's more advanced, intermediate, who is really serious about trying to push themselves and get the best results possible? I absolutely think you should auto-regulate your deloads. If you feel good, you are feeling confident you can beat last week's performance, you should probably just keep going. You shouldn't just arbitrarily deload. But if you're feeling pretty darn beat up, pretty darn fatigued, you're super doubtful you could perform well again for another week, take a week. Like, what are the downsides to having an extra 2 days of recovery that theoretically maybe you didn't need? We just don't know. I think if it lines up with your lifestyle, it might buy you a little bit more accumulation time and hard training, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think we can sometimes be too eager to get back into pushing ourselves to the limit. And I think ultimately you can't outsmart the body here, and the body will then, if you don't give it as much rest, it's going to shorten the amount of time that you can train hard for. If you take more time to rest, you're probably going to buy yourself more time to train hard for. Obviously, there's extremes here that don't work out, but I think overall, with whatever approach you take, it's going to kind of end up looking very similar in the long run. Guys, hopefully this has been interesting and insightful. I'm not going to push myself in that sense again for a while. I probably will experiment in future with these various things, and hopefully it's been interesting hearing about it. And don't skip your deloads, but be smart about them. And it's if you need help with this sort of thing, if you're wondering and you've watched this, you're super confused, you don't really understand what deloads, accumulation, mesocycles, training hard, whatever it might be, you kind of need help with some of your muscle growth training, that's what we do at Revive Stronger. Actually, a lot of the people we coach, the majority of people we coach are coaches. These are the people actually we really like helping, because we can have very high level conversation and dynamic conversations, and we can really get them to understand their body, their fatigue, their kind of ability to train, and really expedite their progress. And they can also learn at the same time and take that for their clients. So we like helping people like that, and that is a big target audience for us. So if you're interested, you can always go to the link in the description to check out our coaching. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next one.